Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. April 13th is one of those dates where humanity seems determined to prove that every civilization, no matter how advanced, eventually uses its talent for either ritual pageantry, theological extortion, or inventing a new and upsetting way to turn public life into performance art. On this day, we get ancient Romans lighting foxes on fire for agriculture, emperors kidnapping popes for career advancement, reformers preaching tolerance while everyone quietly prepares to revoke it later, and modern institutions discovering that whether the arena is a basilica, a battlefield, Hollywood, outer space, or Augusta National, history is often just power wrapped in ceremony and sold as destiny. So tonight, let's walk through an April 13th that contains spiritual drama, imperial nonsense, colonial violence, artistic ambition, technological panic, and the uniquely human ability to say, after causing catastrophe, that things are actually going quite well. Segment 1, Faith, Fire, and the Original Public Relations Stunts. April 13th begins in ancient Rome, where the Cerealia festival honored Ceres, goddess of grain, fertility, and apparently deeply unsettling animal-based symbolism. Romans staged games, feasts, and rituals to keep the harvest on track, because nothing says agricultural confidence like releasing foxes with burning torches tied to their tails into a stadium. That is not farming. That is a Looney Tunes episode written by priests. But it also reveals something important. Public religion in Rome was never just about pleasing the gods. It was about managing the crowd. The plebeian officials running the festival used entertainment, spectacle, and shared ritual to ease class tensions and remind ordinary Romans that civic life still included them, at least until the next tax bill. 1,000 years later, on April 13th, 1111, Henry V took that same fusion of politics and piety and upgraded it into full medieval hostage theater. He marched into Rome, had Pope Pascal II seized, held him captive for 2 months, then got crowned Holy Roman Emperor after the Pope buckled. It is the kind of story that makes you realize medieval Europe was basically a subscription service to ceremonial blackmail. Henry had originally sold himself as the son who respected the church more than his father did, which makes his eventual strategy of kidnapping the Pope feel less like hypocrisy and more like branding evolution. Together, these stories tell you something enduring. If leaders can't get legitimacy from heaven honestly, they will absolutely try to stage manage it with fire, costumes, or armed men inside a basilica. Segment 2. Holy causes ruined by the people carrying them out. If you want to watch ideals get mugged by reality, April 13th offers the Fourth Crusade and the Battle of the Horns of Hama. In 1175, Saladin defeated the Zengids near Hama, consolidating control over Syria and turning fragmented Muslim politics into a more unified front. It was a decisive step toward his later campaigns against the Crusaders. And it came not from a clean moral showdown, but from Muslim factions fighting each other for leadership before they could confront a broader enemy. History loves to leave out the awkward rehearsal dinner before the famous wedding. Then, in 1204, the Fourth Crusade did something even more revealing. Instead of reclaiming the Holy Land, Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the Eastern world. They smashed altars, looted relics, ravaged churches, and managed to turn a mission launched in the name of Christ into a smash and grab against fellow Christians. It takes real dedication to look at a sacred vow and say, what if we made this a finance problem? The Venetians got richer, the Byzantine Empire was shattered, and the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity hardened into a wound that lasted centuries. So in one segment, we have Saladin showing that unity sometimes begins with defeating your supposed allies, and Crusaders proving that an army wearing crosses can still behave like pirates with a liturgy. The lesson is brutal and familiar. Movements collapse when the people claiming to defend civilization are mostly interested in invoices, ego, and who gets the horses on the way out. Segment 3, Tolerance, Identity, and the Violence Behind Nation Building. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, April 13th becomes a showcase for states trying to define who belongs and at what cost. In 1598, Henry IV signed the Edict of Nantes, one of Europe's earliest major acts of religious toleration, allowing French Protestants limited rights after decades of civil war. It was enlightened, practical, and deeply conditional, which is usually how tolerance enters politics, not as a hug, but as paperwork drafted by exhausted survivors. Henry himself had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism to secure the throne, which means the policy was born from principle, but midwifed by realism. A few years later, in 1612, Miyamoto Musashi defeated Sasaki Kojiro in Japan's most famous duel by arriving late, carving a sword from a boat oar, and weaponizing disrespect like it was an art form. Musashi's victory helped define a national legend around discipline, strategy, and self-mastery, even though the fight itself was basically won by psychological trolling and superior timing. Then, in 1613, the English kidnapped Pocahontas and turned abduction into diplomacy, conversion, and eventually propaganda for colonial peace. That peace mainly benefited Jamestown's tobacco economy, which is a recurring colonial theme. First create the violence, then celebrate the stability that follows your hostage negotiation. Across France, Japan, and Virginia, identity was being shaped through law, ritual, and force. Tolerance, legend, and empire all presented themselves as civilizing projects. But every one of them came with a hidden invoice, paid by someone with less power. Segment 4, Founding Myths, Freedom Rhetoric, and the Price of Belonging. April 13th also gives us the machinery of modern political identity, where ideals are announced with one hand while the other hand quietly signs the exclusions. In 1699, Guru Gobind Singh created the Khalsa, transforming Sikhism into a disciplined community of warrior saints defined by spiritual equality and collective defense. It was a radical answer to persecution, shattering caste boundaries and insisting that faith could also be organized courage. In 1742, Handel premiered Messiah in Dublin as a charity event, reviving his career with a work now so culturally dominant that people hear the Hallelujah chorus and assume a mall Santa is legally required to appear. Yet it debuted in spring for Easter, with audiences asked to leave swords and hoop skirts at home so everyone could actually fit inside. That may be the most 18th century sentence ever written. A year later, Thomas Jefferson was born, though because of the calendar shift, his birthday moved from April 2nd to April 13th, which feels appropriate for a man whose legacy is itself a complicated rescheduling of reality. Jefferson wrote soaring words about liberty and equality while living atop a plantation economy built by enslaved people. He championed religious freedom, doubted orthodoxy, read widely across traditions, and still could not bring his life into moral alignment with his philosophy. That contradiction is not a footnote to the American story. It is the wiring. And just to keep the young republic weird, America's first elephant arrived on April 13th, 1796, got displayed for paying customers, and was reportedly fed greens and liquor because nobody here knew what an elephant should eat. Which, honestly, is also a useful summary of early American governance. Grand ambition, total improvisation, and somebody in the background saying, "Have we tried giving it whiskey?" Segment 5. Win progress. Builds a museum in one room and a mass grave in another. The 19th and early 20th centuries on April 13th show what happens when nations congratulate themselves for progress while refusing to count the bodies under the floorboards. Fort Sumter surrendered in 1861 after bombardment in Charleston Harbor, and the Civil War truly began, with the grim irony that the opening bombardment caused no direct combat deaths. The first fatalities came during a ceremonial salute afterward. Even America's bloodiest conflict had to start with a bureaucratic accident. 9 years later, the Metropolitan Museum of Art was incorporated in New York with no building and no collection, just the pure confidence of elites deciding the nation deserved a great museum and trusting reality to catch up later. That is either visionary institution building or the fanciest version of "we'll figure it out in post." But the same date in 1873 brought the Colfax Massacre, where white supremacist militias slaughtered black defenders in Louisiana during Reconstruction, including men who had already surrendered. It was one of the clearest announcements that post-war freedom for black Americans would be sabotaged by terror and then abandoned by law. In 1919, that pattern echoed in Jallianwala Bagh, where British troops under General Dyer fired into an unarmed crowd in Amritsar, trapping civilians in a walled garden and turning imperial order into industrialized terror. That massacre radicalized Indian resistance and stripped away the moral costume of British rule. So on one April 13th, America founded a museum to preserve civilization, while also producing evidence that civilization was being selectively applied. And the British Empire reminded the world that governments often call it stability, when what they mean is, we brought guns to a crowd. The age of spectacle, survival, and cracks in the modern story. Modern April 13th feels less like a clean march toward enlightenment and more like a television montage where triumph, scandal, and catastrophe keep cutting into each other. In 1943, Nazi Germany announced the discovery of the Katyn graves, exposing a real Soviet atrocity while using it for propaganda. That is the moral vertigo of the 20th century. One murderous regime revealing another regime's massacre, and the Allies suppressing the truth because wartime strategy outranked justice for the dead. In 1949, cortisone was announced as a treatment for rheumatoid arthritis, and medicine briefly looked miraculous, with patients going from immobilized pain to visible recovery. In 1964, Sidney Poitier became the first black man to win the Academy Award for Best Actor, shattering a barrier in Hollywood during the Civil Rights era and proving dignity itself could be revolutionary on a stage built by exclusion. In 1970, Apollo 13 suffered its oxygen tank explosion, turning a moon mission into a desperate rescue powered by engineering genius and the most famous understated panic in space history. 5 years later, the Beirut bus massacre ignited the Lebanese Civil War, reminding us that societies can appear cosmopolitan right up until the moment someone decides a crowded bus is an acceptable answer to a political grievance. Then in 1997, Tiger Woods won the Masters, forcing golf to confront its own segregated history, while a young man in a green jacket changed the economics and image of the sport overnight. By 1999, Jack Kevorkian was headed to prison after televising euthanasia to force a legal reckoning, which is perhaps the bleakest possible version of taking your case to the public. Modernity promised transparency, innovation, and inclusion. April 13th keeps showing that the breakthroughs are real, but so are the explosions, cover-ups, massacres, and systems that only change when someone survives them loudly enough to make denial impossible. In conclusion, April 13th is not a tidy pageant of great men and famous dates. It is a cross-section of how societies feed themselves, justify themselves, entertain themselves, and betray themselves. Romans turned agriculture into spectacle. Emperors turned holiness into leverage. Crusaders turned piety into looting. Colonizers turned kidnapping into diplomacy. Reformers turned tolerance into compromise. Empires turned crowds into targets. And modern institutions turned crisis into either breakthrough or legend, depending on who controlled the narrative afterward. But the deeper pattern is that history rarely moves because people suddenly become wise. It moves because contradiction becomes too obvious to ignore. The old order overreaches. The hidden violence becomes visible. The myth cracks, and somebody improvises a new arrangement with a sword, a sermon, a law, a chorus, a speech, a jury-rigged filter, or a golf club. And that is the strangely comforting part. Human beings may never stop dressing power in ceremony, but they also never stop exposing the costume.